Good morning. I'm Pete Najarian on this Tuesday morning. This is The Take with Market Rebellion. I got to say, did yesterday feel like a little bit of a pause? At least it did for me. It felt like the markets were slowing down, kind of looking ahead. The nervousness that they had from last week into this week started to kind of be in the back in the rearview mirror. And that's why it seemed like we were just in a very tight range. And that's exactly what we were in. A little bit more of a range, actually, for the NASDAQ. The NASDAQ had slightly more range, but when it was all said and done, actually only finished the day 20 points higher. On the other hand, you look over at the Dow. Dow had pressure on it for the majority of the session, finished down about 150 points, about 0.5%. Nothing huge. But you look at crude. Crude's kind of been hanging around in this level. Call it 118 to 120. Is it consolidating, or is it just a pause, or what do we got going on right now? We've been up here for a little while, not for terribly long, but it's something that I think a lot of folks, there are the bears out there and the bulls out there. Those who think that energy is going to take another step to the upside, or hey, we've peaked. Now let's not forget, because it wasn't too many months ago that everybody had already said, oh yeah, we've peaked. We've peaked inflation. We've peaked in all this stuff. I'm not so sure that was correct, right? So that's what makes things so much interesting and so much fun. But after a couple of days of getting some great volume days, traded over 51 million contracts last week on Friday. We had also another monstrous 51.5 million contracts on Monday. So you got Friday and Monday, some huge numbers. Then you get into Tuesday, and as I say, almost like it was taking a pause, we actually got all the way back down to 37 million contracts trading yesterday. Gives you an eye-opening look at just how fast things can come to a screeching halt and actually slow down the way they did. And they certainly did. We've also got some pretty interesting volatility, been hanging around up there, actually closed off yesterday. It was in a range called 32 to 34. 32.70 is about where we finished up. And let's not forget about mortgage rates, because that was very topical yesterday. And just a week ago, this is something I talked about last night on the Fast Money Show with Brian Sullivan and the gang. But the interesting part was, you don't have to even go back that far to get a velocity move like we did out of this. You look at the 30-year mortgage that was at a 5.5. Suddenly we're at 6.28 1 week later. That says a lot. And that gives you an idea when we talk about velocity all the time. That's what we're talking about, these sharp moves. And speaking of sharp moves, how about the 2-year? How about the 10-year? 2-year and 10-year, almost dead heat now, sitting there right around, call it 344 for the 2-year, 348 for the 10-year. Gives you a perspective of that fast move that we have had to the upside, when both of those very close to the end part of May, we're trading closer to 2.5, call it 270, whatever. And now look at where we are, just an enormously fast move. From a sector perspective, just kind of a little shifting around. Obviously, technology, we talked about the NASDAQ finishing in positive territory. That was up about 0.5%. Energy squeaked out a little bit into the green yesterday, but that was something that was under a little bit of pressure. Financials were definitely under some pressure as well. Those Chinese names, again, very, very interesting to see. And you look at the FXI, the ETF for many of the names that we talk about all the time. That was up about 3% yesterday. But then you look over at those individual names, bring them up all the time, but it's JD and PDD and Baidu and NetEase all had a really spectacular day yesterday. FedEx talking about what they were going to do and raising their dividend and get more competitive against what we're seeing, in my opinion, at least, with the 10s and the 2s and all the rest of it. That's a big catalyst for them, and that's why I think the stock popped as much as it did. Plus, you add a couple of new directors to the board from an activist group. That's something that's going to kind of get a little bit stirred up as well. And that's what we're seeing, that nice reaction out of the stock yesterday and into today. Oracle, that was post-earnings. We saw those numbers. They were great when you look at their revenue and their growth, particularly obviously in the cloud area where they'd had a lot of strength. Then there was CF, then there was Boeing, and then other names like Monster Beverage. There was some definite strength yesterday, but there was weaknesses as well. Again, DocuSign. And then we go back over to some of the names that are oftentimes staples or defensive or however you want to categorize it. But names like Pepsi yesterday getting hit to the downside, Procter & Gamble, you got Coca-Cola, you've got Home Depot taking a little bit yesterday. Fastenal is another one of those names. So Workday, across the board, we did have some negatives as well. We get into today, the focus is definitely on lasers straightforward at the Fed. You're going to get about 1:15 Eastern time, or no, Central time, and we're going to find out a lot more about what's going on with the Fed, because everybody's been speculating, and obviously now is the day. It's time to pay the piper. Is it going to be 50? Most likely not. Is it going to be 100? Probably not. 75? Sure seems like that's the direction that everybody is looking in right now. So that is the expected. What will happen, we'll find out pretty soon. So you look over at the 2s and 10s. 2s and 10s off a little bit from where they were yesterday, looking at a 333, 337 in that sort of a range. You got volatility kind of starting to come down a little bit as we were looking at some pretty strong markets early on. We got a nice triple-digit gain right now across the board for the NASDAQ, as well as the Dow. The Dow's been up anywhere between, call it close to 300, almost 400. It's eased back closer to 300 again. It was 320 last I looked. And then I'll take a look over at the NASDAQ as well. It was up as much as 220 points to the upside. Last I look, about $1.60. First hour of the day, already seeing some really, really nice trade going on in both, and a nice little bit of a move to the upside. The VXN, I hadn't brought that up as much, but I will tell you the VXN still hanging around up there, close to 38, something we should all keep an eye on, because we're talking about the volatility index of the NASDAQ there. And that's something that I think has been very, very important and a very key element to this whole thing, especially when we have seen the VXN actually breach over that 40, even as recently as this week. So communications, technology, financials, all of them were strong out of the gate. They've added just a little bit as we've gotten a little bit further. Materials have pulled back some. Energy has slipped a little bit, but we're seeing a nice big move out of some of the categories, sectors that I just mentioned. Now I look at names that are really pushing things to the upside today. Boeing, another one of those names. Boston Scientific as well. Throw in a Nucor, Okta, Intuitive Surgical, Moderna, Nike. You get the idea. Throw in a Goldman Sachs having a pretty decent start to the day after being under some pressure. Monster or Microsoft having a pretty decent day as well. What's not really moving too well right now, some of those beta names in energy, but we expect that. We've been getting 2 steps forward, 1 step back. You look at the Chinese names, it's been 3 steps forward, 1 step back. But when I look at energy, it's just been this continual pace to the upside with some either pausing or pulling back. It's exactly what a healthy environment oftentimes looks like. So those beta energy names today, they're under pressure. Names like Occidental, EOG, Pioneer, all under pressure today. I'm looking at Diamondback as well. By the way, we got something coming up in Diamondback in just a second. Chinese names I mentioned a second ago, they were strong yesterday, giving back a little bit today. NetEase and PDD and some of those names. I'm looking at Datadog as well, Lucid. So there's a little bit of a push and pull going on right now, but certainly a much stronger move, at least going into what's going to happen later on with the Fed. That should be pretty interesting. I got 2 unusuals, then we're done for the day. Tesla. Now, Tesla was the very first unusual that we had hit today. Pretty interesting. Stock was trading around 675. We had a buyer of the in-the-money calls. In other words, a little bit lower than where it was. 675 is where they were buying. They were buying the 670s, and those were about 4,500 of those for anywhere between $20 and $25. Not a cheap speculative trade, but it certainly is a nice dollar amount when you multiply that times the 4,500, and it's a $20+ trade. It's a nice chunk of change they're putting down, looking for a little bit of upside and wanting a little bit more delta. In other words, moving a little bit closer to moving like the stock by buying an in-the-money call as opposed to an out-of-the-money call. So that stood out for me. Secondly, I mentioned FANG a second ago, Diamondback, FANG is a symbol there. We've got some buyers there. This one's daggone interesting, I got to tell you. So what they're doing is they are rolling up a trade very deep in the money. So in other words, a surrogate for stock. They had the June 117 calls. They're actually the 117.65s. They're selling 4,300 of those, okay? And they're rolling up, so they're pocketing some money from a very nice trade from a while ago, making some very, very nice money. Stock trading about 150. But they're selling those, but still want to be in the trade. So they're buying 4,300 of the January 127 calls. They're actually 127.65 calls. So if you take a look, you'll see that happening out there. And they're going all the way out to January. They're still deep in the money calls, but they're taking these other deep in the money calls, at least some of them, off the table, taking a lot of money off the table, but still wanting to be involved in the trade. Those are the trades that get very, very interesting for me. So I'm going to have to figure that one out before the end of the day. Folks, have a great day of trading. If you didn't understand any of the derivative side of things that I was talking about, you got to understand that. That's where the growth is. That's where a lot of the trade is. We all know that. And because of that, you want to get educated. Get books, look online, try to find your best way. And of course, Market Rebellion, great educators here. I got to tell you, Bill and the gang do an absolutely magnificent job. Folks, have a great day of trading. We'll see you tomorrow.